I'm James Hughes, bioethicist and resident techno-progressive.
And I'm Nir Isakovich, philosopher and resident Luddite.
And you're listening to Prosthetic Gods, an optimist and a grump on tech, a podcast where we explore the social, ethical, and political impacts of emerging technologies.
As befits a sunny day, today we are going to interrogate some of Dr. Hughes's intellectual biography, the occasion being that he has just published a really interesting essay called Buddhist Cyborgs, Enhancing Change Beyond Identity Essentialisms. And I thought, the essay's basic point is that Buddhism's conception of personhood and personal identity, or lack thereof, is a great foil for thinking about technology, thinking about enhancement, thinking about at least Jay's conception of transhumanism. So I thought it would be a good opportunity to go a little bit behind the curtain of this show and of Jay's career, and ask a little bit how he developed his interest in Buddhism and how it shapes his idea of technology. So
Sure.
This is a treat for our listeners.
So I appreciate talking about myself. It's one of my favorite topics.
Well, there you go. There you go. It's a good topic. It's a good topic. So, to Jay's favorite topic, Jay, how did you become a Buddhist before we dig into your essay?
I was raised a Unitarian Universalist in Columbus, Ohio, and my parents were both atheists. By the time I was like 7 years old or so, something like that, I had decided that I was an atheist. And then in Unitarian Sunday school, they introduced you to all the world's religions. And that was the first place where I was introduced to Buddhism as a religious option. So at that point, I wasn't terribly engaged, but when I was in high school, started smoking dope and dropping acid, and getting interested in the kind of Eastern religious offerings. And my mom's first boyfriend was a meditator and Buddhist. And he and I talking to him when I was about 15. It's like, dude, we're just atoms floating in space, and what's the point of existence? And he's like, here, read this D.T. Suzuki, and here, read this Baba Ram Dass. So I started meditating, started getting into Eastern philosophy, and found the Buddhist resolution to the problem of materialist meaninglessness. That was really what was driving me at the time, 15, 16, was basically a pragmatic one. And it said, you don't need to worry about, what the ultimate meaning of the universe is, or the ultimate goods and bads. Just look at your own mind and what you're trying to do, which is to reduce suffering, and realize that your reducing suffering is connected to other people's reducing suffering, and that you can achieve that through meditation and so forth. So that was the initial appeal. But of course, then there's 2,500 years of culture and philosophy to dig into. And that eventually led me to working for a Buddhist development organization in Sri Lanka, and ordaining as a monk for some period of time, and then trying to decide whether to be a Buddhist scholar. Didn't have the language chops, ended up in social theory, sociology. But the questions that motivated me in graduate school were questions that came out of Buddhism about the nature of personhood, and how that might be politically relevant today. And that is what led also to this essay, which is that the Buddhist idea is about the nature of self, which is kind of radically deconstructing the ontology of the self and pointing out the ways in which overly reified the understandings of the self lead to a lot of our suffering. That is a useful framework for understanding some of the ethical and psychological challenges of an enhancement future.
Yeah. So let's dig into that about the sense of self. So just so we're all on the same page, say a little bit more about what a reified sense of self is that's being rejected, and then tell us a little bit about this Buddhist alternative of the process conception of self that you talk about.
Well, Buddhism emerged in the context of Vedic Hinduism 2,500 years ago. And in Vedic Hinduism, you basically had a pure soul essence, which was going to be reincarnating from life to life. And each life it acquired, it had karmic obligations to fulfill and karmic debts to pay off. And eventually, if you're lucky, that soul essence will reunite, its eternal bit will reunite with the eternal great soul essence in the sky, Atman, and there'll be this theistic reunification of self and God. The Buddhists or the Buddha came along and said, no, all of that's nonsense, because if you look inside your mind, you don't find that soul essence, that observer that you think is in there is not actually there. And you find that out by trying to turn the observer on itself, look to get the observer to look at itself. And when you do that and you start to realize that what you're doing all the time is creating self, there's selfing going on, the selfing that your brain does just because you're a meat animal. And when you start to see through that selfing, you start to let go of a lot of it, because there's no why create that suffering for yourself when you're doing all that selfing. So that's really the starting point of the kind of Buddhist psychological appeal, which is to say, look at your own brain, stop doing all that crazy stuff. You're inventing reality that's not there. You're ruminating about things that you don't need to ruminate about. You're creating an image of yourself to hold on to that will just make you miserable.
And is there a sort of everyday, pragmatic, more loose idea of self that is suggested in the place of the sort of stable Western self, like this process self? Is it some kind of replacement or placeholder?
Buddhism, again, is 2,500 years old and it's been in many different places. And so there have
Right.
been sects of Buddhism that have approximated the Christian or theistic or Hindu understandings of self as a kind of universal, pure substance of some kind. So this is the debate about the Buddha mind. Is there such a thing, kind of fundamental panpsychic awareness in the universe that you tap into that's somewhat like the Buddha, the Hindu idea of Atman? But most Buddhists deny that and insist on Atman. There is no self. That's the kind of central teaching. It's one of the three central teachings: the impermanence of all things, and the fact that holding on to things creates suffering, and that there is no self.
Yeah. And in everyday life, what does that cash out to? Because I'm assuming that just pragmatically going around thinking that you don't exist or that there is no self can be pretty destabilizing for people. So in everyday life, does that, if you're not a Buddhist philosopher or a Buddhist monk, does that cash out into not taking yourself as seriously as you would under a more robust Western metaphysical, dualistic, inner outer kind of view? Is it more like, I have all of these neurotic tendencies, or I have all of these what I thought were, psychological fixations, but I'm not going to be as serious about them because I understand that they're contingent? So, like, how does this actually cash out for somebody who takes Buddhism seriously but is not a Buddhist scholar, if that makes sense?
Well, let's say for the vast majority of Buddhists throughout history, it has been a series of religious or magical practices that they took solace in. So it's, to try to retcon the Western philosophical understanding of Buddhism to what every peasant in Buddhist history has ever done is stupid, because some of them were just, believing the local mountain god and thinking that one was a Buddha too. So that's fine. Yeah. All of those different kinds of resources are useful, but the contemporary meditation flavored answer is that, that you by understanding in a moment to moment way, seeing through our psychological processes in a moment to moment way by being incredibly present through the practice of meditation. You can have a taste of what a non-dual life is like. Like for me, it's those brief experiences during meditation where proprioception dropped away and I had a feeling of oneness with the universe.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had those experiences, but you can't,
Mm-hmm.
drive when you're doing that. So
Right.
you have to come back to the village. And when you come back to the village, there's all the old questions. It's like, do I pay my
Mm-hmm.
taxes or not? So that unity, and philosophically we would say in Zen, for instance, that's the unity of samsara and nirvana, that there is no real distinction between being a liberated enlightened being, the life that you lead, and the life that you still have to do your dishes and still have to do the
Yeah.
laundry.
Yeah. So this Buddhist emphasis that in popular culture comes out a lot, and when people talk about meditation on the present moment, on being present in the here and now, as I listen to you, it becomes clear that that's conditioned on marginalizing the sort of uh, traditional self, right? Because if you manage to sort of put that aside a little bit or push it a little bit to the back, it becomes easier to be present at whatever is happening around you now, right? Because you have less mediation and more meditation.
Right. I should emphasize that the meditation oriented intuitivist approach to Buddhist ethics is, I think, contestable on the grounds that Buddhism also has enormous resources for discursive understandings of morality and of what you should be doing. Um, but insofar as it is also asking you to put discursiveness aside and just have an intuitivist approach, that it starts from the intuitivist approach. It starts from I feel the bubbling up of human empathy and sympathy in my being, and
Mm-hmm.
therefore I want to be a good pro-social being. Then Buddhism says, okay, well, if you want to be a good pro-social being, here's 5,000 things to think about in terms of all the moral codes that you can apply and how you can apply them.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So is there is there an encouragement to because some interpretations of Judaism, for example, the tradition that I come from, not all interpretations, but some interpretations of it are so practice oriented and as a way to distract from big metaphysical thoughts, which are taken to be not always helpful. Were you talking about something like that, or am I misunderstanding?
Yes, I mean, I think there have been times, and I don't think this is always great, but there have been times in my experience of Buddhism where I was troubled by something, went to a Buddhist teacher, and they said, "Well, you just need to do more prostrations, or you just need to sit on that, and you'll let go of that eventually."
Hmm.
and uh,
Hmm.
and I think that's
But
an
the
appropriate answer for some kinds of
yeah,
complaints. But
yeah.
I think that kind of anti-intellectualism can also be really problematic, and it's what in the Western Buddhist circles it's led to the tolerance of immoral behavior by Buddhist teachers because we had separated them from the traditional discursive understandings of what a moral code should be for them.
Hmm. So that leads us directly to this question that you've heard both from me and apparently from many others, which is how do you square or how do you reconcile between the importance of having a moral compass and moral principles and the fact that there's no self to which to ascribe them. So you're a good person, you have beliefs about, why fascism sucks and why social democracy is good and why you love your family. If there's no self as a substratum to attach those to, why should I take your moral beliefs seriously? And why should it matter to you if you do those things rather than be a fascist, capitalist, and someone who's not nice to your family?
Well, Sam Harris, he wrote a book about social policy and tried to connect it
By
to
the
that.
way, just to clarify, fascism and capitalism are not synonymous.
No,
So, no,
no, capitalism may lead
not for me.
ineluctably to fascism in some
Yeah,
circumstances. Um, Sam Harris
Sam
is
Harris.
Sam Harris is somebody who's tried to square the meta-ethical nut here, and in a way that I think is instructive for Buddhists trying to do the same, in that you can say, look, I think that the goal should be the reduction of suffering for all beings. That is, if you are looking for Buddhist goals, moral goals, the reducing of suffering of all beings is one of the goals. Now, how do you become the kind of person who really devotes your life to reducing the suffering of all beings? That's called the Bodhisattva vow. And
Mm-hmm.
so that moral quest to become a sufficiently good person that you are reducing the suffering of all beings is in fact what leads to the reduction of your own suffering, that committing yourself to that project. So anyway,
Mm-hmm.
all these different moral codes get connected, but I would say that the connection with Sam Harris is, I agree, and I think there's a strong argument within Buddhism. In fact, Robert Thurman, Uma Thurman's dad, is a Tibetan Buddhist scholar, and he's written a whole book about how early Buddhism is an argument for social democracy, which I think is perhaps a bit of a stretch, but I like the direction that he's going, because what he's making an argument like Sam Harris. It's like, if we accept that the goal is the creation of a society in which everyone has enough, and they have enough freedom, and they have enough education to fulfill their aspirations as human beings and find liberation of their own kind. If that's the goal, that kind of eudaimonic or capabilities approach, in my mind, goal for consequentialism, then you need to figure out, as a person, if you want to contribute to that, you need to figure out all the things that are necessary about how you can wisely contribute to that project. And so that's the political education part of it, and understanding the world and being cosmopolitan and thinking about everybody equally. And to my mind, it's like, you really need to think like UNICEF. Where is all the suffering in the world, and how do we fix that suffering? But you also need to have a certain vision of what overcoming suffering looks like. And for a Buddhist, I think that involves both a certain amount of freedom. It does not involve theocratic social control, but it also involves certain guidelines. It's like certain kinds of lives would be less worth living than others.
But doesn't thinking like UNICEF make you more like Mother Teresa and less like James Hughes? In other words, like, how do you get from UNICEF to being a good friend?
UNICEF, the only problem with UNICEF is it never had enough guns.
Okay, fine. UNICEF with guns, but still, how do you get from UNICEF with guns, which we should devote a different episode to dissuading people from, but how do you get from UNICEF with guns to being a good friend and a good dad and whatever? Like, those are very, I mean, I know you're a universalist, but you're not only a universalist.
If you need to find religious or doctrinal resources for why you should be a good person or why you should be a good dad, I think that's the first problem, right? I think that's a description of a sociopath, right? Someone who's looking up the description of what a good person should be so that they can follow the code. The Buddhist idea is not necessarily that we are all innately good, but that there is within us the capacity to feel an innate pro-social sympathy for others.
Yeah, but even there, different people have slightly different moral compasses, right? So some people will be good and will prioritize some sort of pro-social success at work and mentorship in their sort of list of priorities, and some will prioritize their family and their friends, and being a decent person at work will be in third or fourth place. And where does that moral compass come from if you're a Buddhist and not allowed to have a self?
You don't have a self.
Right.
It's not that you're not allowed. It's because you don't have a self. The selfing, the illusory selfing that everyone is doing is causing a lot of these problems. That's the first observation here. Look, I think part of what is important to realize about Buddhism and about any religious tradition is that the monastic commitment, the highest commitment, the commitment to say, I'm going to make the focus of my life overcoming suffering and achieving enlightenment or whatever, that is a different level of commitment than being a layperson. And the vast majority of us look at those trade-offs and decide, well, whatever I'm going to accomplish, it's going to be as a layperson and not as a monk. But I think that the acknowledgement of monastic life is that it's an okay option. If you decide that if these things are so important that that's the only thing you're going to care about in this life, that's an okay option. And I think that that's an important message. That's the Durkheimian point, is that having monastic vocations in your society raises the moral bar for everybody.
Yeah. Is it a version of selfing to say, to reverse the traditional direction? In other words, rather than say, I have a fixed sense of self that comes to me from religion or from whatever source, and from that sense of self flow some moral principles, to say instead, I reach for some moral possibilities for whatever reason, whether it was how I grew up or to oppose how I grew up. I reach for being a good dad. I reach for being a good friend. I reach for being in the Peace Corps. And as I reach for these, I constitute a sense of self that is somewhat provisional until I reach for more or less and revise those for continuing reasons.
I think you just described your own internal meditative understanding of how you come to those conclusions, which is great. I applaud you, Nir. I think this is a great session so far for you.
I love being applauded. I'm asking if that is if that's consistent with a Buddhist sense of
there are some
personing, or
if
however
you
you
want
call
to
it.
be doctrinal about it, there are a couple of places where the Buddha says this is how a husband should treat a wife, and where a wife should treat a husband, and so forth. There are such resources within Buddhism, and certainly within the pastoral education of Buddhists over history. But in terms of your own meditative or deconstructive understanding of how you come to moral codes, I think that's what leads to a great deal of intellectual humility. For me, this is the connection between Buddhist mindfulness and intellectual virtue, is that the more that you see how you construct all of the verities in your life, the kind of existential void that and the epistemological void that we really exist in, and that yet we have to exist in this world, and we have to say, will the sun come up tomorrow? Probably. And so all of these things that we're constantly doing become more transparent to ourselves. And as a consequence, it becomes much easier to be intellectually humble towards others.
Yeah. Slowly moving towards how this has informed your view of technology and technological possibility. How does this kind of view of so you're a transhumanist, and you should try to make the connection. What is the connection between being a transhumanist, namely refusing the thought and idea and determination that there is a biologically or otherwise closed set of human abilities, commitment to the notion that what we can do, what we can think, what we can feel can be technologically expanded and ever expanded, and we can sort of continually self-overcome. How does your transhumanism relate to your Buddhism, if I can put it most broadly?
Well, to be honest, as a confession, when I was a teenager, I think part of the connection was the idea of a kind of Batman-esque self-overcoming. And I remember reading Doc Savage, who was a 1930s early version of Batman, that I was reading in the 60s as a science fiction head. And Doc Savage would get up every morning, and he would do like an hour of rigorous calisthenics and, swinging himself around in his home gym. And then he would, read the news for half an hour, and then he would meditate for half an hour. And it was like they had this combination of physical regimen with mental and spiritual regimen. And I think that was appealing to me, the notion that a way to navigate life and adolescence was to have rigid self-control in that way.
Hmm.
And I was also a futurist and a science fiction kid from very young. And so the idea that eventually we would have these technologies which would allow various kinds of transcension was appealing. And I think in general, if you're attracted to science fiction, you're probably more positive about those options, those transhumanist options, than not. But it was when I started to really interrogate what Buddhist ethics might say about these things that I began to see that Buddhism had an openness to the human form and to human achievement and possibility that the Abrahamic traditions, at any rate, did not. And I think there's a certain openness in the part of Confucianism and Shintoism and animist traditions and so forth that I could also talk about. But just comparing Abrahamic traditions, where you're born as in the Abrahamic cosmology, we started relatively recently and historically as human beings. There was no evolution traditionally in that understanding. And we, each of us, get one life, and that life is going to be a human life, and human lives are the only lives that are important. So when you contrast that with the Hindu Buddhist cosmology, where whatever is going on through multiple lives that include animals and demons and demigods, and sometimes you're going to be a god. And when you're a god, you might live 80,000 years, and your life might be full of pleasure. So there's going to be all kinds of experiences that you will traverse through. None of them are you, right? So for the Hindu, none of them are you because you are really Atman, and for the Buddhist, none of them are you because you don't really exist. But it's the same basic idea. I think there's also a radically different understanding of life extension in certainly Confucianism, Taoism, and many animist traditions also have some idea of at least health extension as a legitimate part of your spiritual life. But in Buddhism, it was very clear from the very beginning that our short lives, long lives, we started with long lives because we were morally pure. And then we became immoral and impure. And this, you asked me where my social democratic convictions come from. One of the things that the early Buddhist myth says, the reason we become impure is because the king forgets to make sure that there's no poverty in the kingdom. And once there's no poverty in the kingdom, then there starts to be acquisitiveness over land. And once there's acquisitiveness over the land, people start to kill each other because of land. And then you need to have cops, and cops start to kill people, and then everything goes to hell. And from that point, that moral degradation, the co-evolution of us morally as beings with our society, means that our lifespans begin to diminish until we eventually end up with world war and almost everybody dying. And then we climb back up from that until the next Buddha. And when we climb back up, eventually we become pure enough, again, as a society, as individuals, and as a society, that our lifespans are 80,000 years long. So that connection between the human body and social perfection and personal perfection, for me, I didn't understand it all when I was 17. But for me, that led to saying, okay, I'm a Buddhist, and I'm a socialist, and I'm a futurist. So how do those three things communicate with each other?
Yeah. So it's almost like I was getting Rousseau vibes when you were making that point that it's sort of the individuation, competition, and ambition that are responsible for uh, um, so much of our suffering. While Rousseau has a kind of tragic view of that, namely there's no going back. Buddhism has a less tragic view of that, namely that it was never real in the first place, and you shouldn't
Yeah.
take it that seriously.
The state of nature was basically everybody on universal basic income. And, and once we got away from that, everything went to crap.
There, there you go. State of nature ruled by Bernie Sanders.
That's right.
So, um, so you if I'm connecting your transhumanism to what you said about the sort of metaphysics and the Abrahamic tradition, if you don't believe that we were created in God's image, if you don't believe that there's a sort of natural human form and a set of qualities, if you don't take that form seriously, if you're not in some basic way a humanist, then why would you, and here I move to your view of technology, then why would you be anxious or outraged about sort of extending yourself and memory through retinal implants or putting a wallet in the palm of your hand, right? There's nothing being violated on your view in the first place.
Right.
Or why would you be anxious about, taking regularly an oxytocin supplement to be a nicer person? If you're not committed to niceness coming from some sort of rational,
Right.
individual rational figuring out.
I don't disagree with when bioconservatives attack this thing or that thing on the grounds of human authenticity or agency or human dignity. I don't object usually, but I usually agree with what they're criticizing. But I disagree that that we should be using these concepts, which are basically proxies, for hand waving at something about the self that you haven't really proven and that I don't think exists, right? I don't think that there's an authentic self. So if there's no authentic self, then don't try to convince me that we shouldn't do social media because it violates the authentic self. What we're doing is what we're doing. And we are
Yeah.
now selfing in different ways than we selfed 10,000 years ago. And that's just the way things are. The question is there a healthier and happier way to self?
See, but if you really didn't believe there was an authentic self, half of the time you should probably be agreeing with me that there is an authentic self. In other words, you don't behave in life as if there was an authentic self. We've been doing this podcast now coming on the second year. We're writing a book of dueling essays together in which we debate each other. And you're recognizably you in these debates, brilliant, crazy, wrong, you, right? And you're been consistently a social democrat. You've been consistently a progressive. You've been, wrong about many of those things too. Never, one of the smarter ones I know, but still wrong. But to not tease you for a moment, you say that you're not committed to there being an authentic, stable self, but you are sort of acting pretty stably and having recognizable, stable views, and those commitments to not there not being a stable self seem to be attached to a pretty stable substratum. So is that just a practical, you got to go to the village kind of thing, or how do you
Well,
how does
I
one
mean,
make sense of that?
stability is in the eye of the beholder. You haven't watched enough of the river go by yet. When we wrote about grief bots, I mean, part of the question is, okay, if I want to pass along a version of myself to my kids, which version do I want to pass along? Do I want to pass along the version that's 98 and lost all its marbles and can't even, put a coherent narrative together
Hmm.
about my life? Do I want to do
Yeah.
it when I'm 68 and I can put a coherent narrative about my life? Do I do it when I'm 48 when I'm still more optimistic and full of piss and vinegar? None of them are the true self. And so if you say that there's a true self morally in terms of my moral or political convictions, that means that I'm locked in somehow, that I'm
Yeah.
committing suicide if I change my mind, and I don't believe that.
Yeah, I guess for me, I mean, this is one of the oldest metaphysical questions in the book. I mean, I guess to me, this goes back to sort of Aristotle's metaphysics and the idea that in order to make sense to each other and to communicate, there have to be, for example, nouns in the language, and nouns are fixed and stable, entities. We are talking about Buddhism rather than, a discrete, unique Buddhist. So it's almost like to communicate even about the lack of personal identity, there has to be some kind of pretense of personal identity.
Right. Well, I think this is where it connects with like Wittgenstein and contemporary understandings of
Hmm.
word-based epistemology, basically, that it's okay to say that the only thing that we know about the world is through this language curtain, which is only defined by the relationship of every word to every other word. And,
Mm-hmm.
that there's only this kind of tenuous relationship between this language curtain and the actual underlying reality. But that's
Mm-hmm.
okay. That's because that's all there is, really. And there's no way
Mm-hmm.
around it. And when you look past the language curtain, you don't really see anything because you can't describe it and there's no words for it.
Mm. Okay. Um, in the essay, you also talk about the Buddhist sense of self or lack of self as being helpful and instructive for rejecting gender dualisms. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Well, sure. But let me also just comment on the wisdom of repugnance, because I think
Mm-hmm.
this was, again, one of the places where Buddhism, one of the meditations that I always liked and that I actually taught in the course that I met my wife in back in college was how to decompose the body into like 108 different disgusting bits.
Oh.
And monks would be given that
She must
meditation.
have said, "Let's go out with that
She was impressed.
guy."
So I
Yeah.
think it was when we meditated in the cemetery on the
Yeah.
decomposition of corpses.
There you go.
But but
Romantic first date. Yeah.
but when monks would, especially if they were suffering from lust, they could get assigned this meditation to think about how disgusting the human body is. And so when I began to get into the moral neuroscience literature, I began to realize that this disgust part, this wisdom of repugnance, morally, the argument is if you feel disgust about something, that tells you something morally about it. And
Mm-hmm.
and I think from a Buddhist intuitivist point of view, it's very important to say, well, what does it tell us exactly? That when we see disgust coming up, what exactly does it tell us? And I think Buddhism says it doesn't really tell you anything. It tells you you can look at things dispassionately and look through them and realize that that there should be some repugnance there, but it doesn't really tell you anything morally. Anyway, the wisdom of repugnance, I think, is a non-Buddhist idea. But in terms of gender, let's talk about gender. Buddhism is arguably pretty feminist in its initial origin. It was one of the first religious orders in India to admit women. Monastic traditions, I think, are in general a way for people to escape from sex gender obligations in their society, especially for LGBT people, but also just asexual people or people who want to do something else with their life, like concentrate and meditate or learn. And so a lot of nuns joined to escape from patriarchy, and I think that that's important in general for these kinds of traditions. But in terms of the doctrine of the self being post-gender, what I mean by that is, okay, do you think, if you think that in the Abrahamic tradition that God created you and gave you a special mission in life and gave you a body, and that body is in imago Dei, it's a reflection of God somehow, which means that whatever that means, that for
Mm-hmm.
Christians and Jews at any rate. And but that God has a gender, and that you have a gender, and that the gender you got was one that God gave you. Now that's where we're at right now with the debate, right? With people
Mm-hmm.
saying you can't really become a woman because you were actually determined to be a man by God at birth. Now, if you're sufficiently Gnostic to say, no, there's the inner reality of me is beyond male and female, then that can lead to certain consequences in terms of how you dress and behave. And throughout history, trans people who violate sex gender norms have been often imbued with shamanic powers. They've been seen as spiritually powerful because of that violation of norms. So that's one way that this gets dealt with in society. But within Buddhist society, there was also specific descriptions of certain kinds of men who were not allowed to become monks. If you were too queer, basically, or a slave or a eunuch, you were not allowed to become monks. So not terribly progressive there. And also the nuns that were admitted, they still had to do extra rules as if they were subordinate to monks. So the history of Buddhism, I would say, is mostly patriarchy, but it's a little bit less patriarchy than everywhere
Mm-hmm.
else, and a little bit less gender normative than
so as if
And the most important point is that Buddhism does not think it's a religious obligation to get married or have a family or have children. So
Hmm.
it's Buddhism is not religiously prenatalist, and therefore it does not put extra obligations on men or women in order to fulfill those roles.
Interesting. So is it fair to say that because Buddhism rejects the kind of reifying of these dualisms that the Abrahamic traditions have between female and male, even though its history um, is a paternalist history, it has more sort of tools for criticizing that history?
That's right, and it's less. Well, the way I framed it in the essay is that Buddhism is less attached to the essential nature of gender as a part of your identity. Right? If you believe that it's a
Because it's less
divine,
attached to essentials, period.
it's a less attached to essentials. Period, and certainly your gender identity is not part of whatever moral obligations you have in this world. Now, that's less true for Hinduism because being born male or female is a part, and for Buddhism being born male is better than being born female. And the Buddha is always going to be born male before he achieves enlightenment. But in
Hmm.
Hinduism, being born male or female has karmic obligations with it. And that's even more so in the theistic traditions where God presumably
Yeah.
had a reason to make you a man.
Okay, so I would assume that the same lack of attachment to the human form, imago Dei, humanism, natural, what it means to be a man and a woman, etc., the same kind of set of arguments would also explain why you're very sympathetic to either invasive or non-invasive brain-computer interfaces, namely you as a Buddhist or Buddhists in general would reject the reality or the absoluteness of the inner outer distinction, the private public distinction. It's just not such a big deal to extend your brain by attaching a computer to it and let other people read it, etc. Is that fair? Or so the sort of
It's certainly
Neuralink
fair
world?
as a description of how I got here, but it's not fair in terms of description of Buddhists or even Buddhist academia,
Hmm.
because the vast majority of them are critical of brain-computer interfaces for the same reasons. But
But can they
that
be critical of it
non-Buddhists.
and be coherent?
Well, that's what I would argue with them is that I would say, look, I don't think you're getting Buddhism's essential point here. That if you're worried that something that this violates the sanctity of the self inside the brain, you're not paying attention to what Buddhism's saying. But at the same time, this means that Buddhists are acutely attuned to the moral moment that we're in, which is not only the violation of the sense of self by these machines, but also the creation of a sense of self in machines. I think that that's why Buddhism is an especially potent heuristic for looking at the emergence of machine intelligence, machine consciousness, sentience, as well as for the ways in which machines are going to affect our sentience and our self-awareness. And I do think that it's important that we not change ourselves so fast or so in such radical ways that we feel like we've committed suicide. We don't want, and I think there's been a bit of a revisionism about Buddhism and psychology over the last 5-6 years because there's growing evidence that certain kinds of meditative practices for certain kinds of people can be psychologically harmful. You can become unmoored. When we were talking about the simulation hypothesis, that's an example of one of these kind of left-hand path spiritualities. It's like, well, if you start walking around thinking that everything's a dream and that people don't really die because they don't really exist in the first place, that can be a psychopathology. It can lead to misery in your life. So, yeah.
Yeah. Um, so the essay, in different contexts, moral enhancements, brain-computer interfaces, gender dualisms, the rejection of the wisdom of repugnance argument that bioconservatives make, it's an argument that Buddhism sits well in the end with the transhumanist techno-progressive agenda, namely the agenda that you can improve ourselves and our state through technological means without worrying too much about maintaining the human form. I mean, I guess I slightly go back to the beginning point that we were discussing, namely, why care so much about improving ourselves and techno-progressivism if we don't care about ourselves in the first place? Um,
Well, yeah,
so,
why do we care about anything? I think that, again, this goes back to the intuitivist Buddhist starting point. I think it is the starting point, is that you have to be able to get in touch with an inner place that says that we should care about suffering in the world, at least our own suffering, if not other people's suffering. And
mhm.
eventually, as you understand your own suffering and other people's suffering, and the suffering of all sentient beings. I mean, again, the part of Buddhism is extending the moral circle to include all sentient beings. So, what does it mean
Mhm.
to not just care about other human beings, but also animals and non-human life? Um,
Yeah.
so, but
Yeah, there's
that
a push. I mean, there's almost. I mean, this is an unsolvable problem. There's almost, like you said, from the nature of language, there's a necessary push and pull there that if you're going to care about suffering, there needs to be at least practically a substratum doing the caring, even though the key to its reducing suffering is not being so concerned with its status as a substratum. But I mean, that's just, there's
right?
no getting
Does
out of
can
that.
you have caring without a carer? Right. That's the
Yeah,
question.
you need at least some kind of provisional care that you don't take too seriously. I mean, a lot of what I'm getting, which I think is actually really attractive and interesting, is that it's a much more, at the very least, it's a much more playful and flexible metaphysic than the Abrahamic one.
And
Uh,
I definitely appealed to me because Unitarianism was inherently self-creation, because there was basically a bunch of atheists saying, okay, we're going to play church now. What do we do to play church? And I think Buddhism basically has been doing that for 2,500 years, but then every religion has. I mean, when we were arguing about, you didn't think that AI should be used in religious instruction, I'm like, come on, every religion is always constantly recreating itself with these things.
yeah, yeah. Um, I wanted to ask you a little bit or divert the conversation a little bit to David Hume, which interestingly is the figure in at least the Western philosophical tradition who comes closest to these ideas of self
That's right.
that we've been talking about. So Hume famously says that personal identity and the self are fiction, that they're a bundle of quickly changing perception, just like your description in the beginning of our conversation. When you turn your gaze inside, you don't find the self, but just a sort of kaleidoscope of images that changes with great rapidity. And so the self is a sort of narrative invention that we attach to phenomenon to be more comfortable about them rather than something that exists in a
And
reified
I
way.
think the two other people to mention quickly is Locke, who said, "Okay, what does God need to bring back for the judgment? Does he need to bring back all your atoms, or just your memories?" And his conclusion was that only your memories needed to be resurrected in the day of judgment. And that, I think, is a central idea in the Enlightenment, that we are equivalent to our psychic selves. But Hume is interrogating that in the Buddhist way, which is to say, okay, if we're our psychic
Yeah,
selves and we look at our psychic selves, do we really see evidence of a self? And no.
yeah.
And then the third
So
person is Parfit, but we can talk about that. But
yeah. So I wanted to ask you about Hume. So the similarities here. I'm not an expert on Hume. I love him, but I'm certainly not an expert on him. Um, in the appendix to the Treatise of Human Nature, where I mean, he makes the point in the treatise itself. In the appendix, he comes back to this question of personal identity, and he says something like, it's been a while, but he says something like the self, if it's anything at all, is more like a state It's more like a republic where whatever identity it has consists in the relationship between the different parts rather than in the identity of the parts over time. It's a little bit like the image of the ship of Theseus that you like to bring up, namely, um, Coca-Cola or the United States stay Coca-Cola from the 18th to the 19th to the 20th. I mean, Coca-Cola is only from the 19th, but century or however long those existed, not because the specific executives and the specific workers in the specific positions are the same ones, but because there's broadly a structure, a constitution, a org chart that more or less is recognizable over time. And he says maybe something like that is true about the self. Is that for Buddhism? What's the status of that kind of argument? Is that what you meant in the essay when you talked about the patternist self?
Well, patternism is basically an updating of Locke for people who think that we could upload ourselves to computers. It's like, well, what is it that you're trying to capture to upload to computers that you would be comfortable calling you? And it's some pattern of
Yeah,
memory and personality and
right.
whatever's in the head.
Yeah.
And that's where the Buddhist says, guess what? That you're never going to find anything there that is that
Mm-hmm.
you can call you. You can take pictures every day. You can take them with high resolution, low resolution, anything you want. You're still not going to find anything, and that's the
Mm.
Humean point. Yeah.
Well, but I mean, I guess Hume is more comfortable with a sort of diluted version of a broad pattern and tendencies. That's the point that he's making.
Well,
Namely, there's
yeah,
no personal identity in the survival of the specific people, specific memories, specific functionaries, but there could be in the way that memories are supposed to relate to each other. So my sense would be that Hume is more comfortable with that kind of broad sense of identity as a set of relations, where you and the Buddhists are not, or are you?
um, well, Buddhism
I mean, I'm
doesn't.
more curious about you, by the way, because
Okay,
Buddhism,
yeah,
there's such a huge tent.
right.
So you, as a sort of, uh, as someone who's adopted many tenets of this thinking, are you comfortable with this human idea of the ship of Theseus consists in a way in a blueprint of the ship rather than in the specific
Correct.
nature of the pieces of
Yeah,
timber?
that's the pattern. I think that's the most charitable interpretation of patternism,
Yeah,
and the one that you could see moving forward from a Buddhist point
yeah,
of view, which is, look, don't worry about it whether it's the real pattern, but
yeah,
we can discern a pattern, and insofar as we can copy that pattern, we've copied
yeah,
you. Yeah.
yeah. Is that kosher? I mean, I like that very much, but do you?
Yes, although I mean, again, the Buddhist says, look, let's just all be clear. This is not you. This is just a copy of something that thinks that it's you, just like you are currently a copy of something that thinks that it's
Well,
you.
but doesn't the Buddha say it's not you, but it's more you than the specific pieces of timber and wood?
I don't know even if a Buddhist was, I mean, yes, it's, I mean, if you
Forget about the
feel,
Buddhist. What about you?
yeah, for what I feel, I wake up in
Yeah,
the morning. Metzinger, by the way, is describing my daily experience. And when he
yeah,
writes about the tunnel self, he says, when you wake up in the morning, one of the first things you have to do is remind yourself who you are, right?
hmm,
So we are going through, and meditatively, you can see this in the emergence of
yeah,
self in the world in every thought, right? And so the gap between every thought in your brain
yeah.
is the emptiness that we're talking about here. But yeah, I
But
wake
you
up
do
every
remind yourself.
but you do remind yourself, because
Yeah.
that is the only way to live a happy and meaningful life so far as we understand it, right?
So you remind yourself. I'm maybe you'll be displeased, but I'm feeling a lot better now. You remind yourself of this vague pattern, right? Even though, you know, at our age we lose our hair and we lose some of our mobility, etc. You remind yourself of the vague pattern that there is a sort of loosely discernible outline of the ship of Theseus, even if it keeps consisting of very different planks.
From 2016 to 2020, it was waking up every morning and reminding myself that I'm the person who is going to help fight this nightmare.
There you go.
I confess that after that, I went into more of a nihilistic despair, and that piece of my self affirmation fell
Yeah,
away. But
but there's probably others now, right? Now that
yeah,
you've retired, you're more committed to your writing and to your public intellectual pursuits, and maybe you remind yourself of that. Or I mean,
yeah,
I'm just
we wake
right.
up as the invisible man, and we have to put on clothes. And
Yeah.
yeah, right.
So that goes to one of my favorite passages in Hume. I mean, so Hume famously talks about the fact that there's no personal identity and there's no causality in the thing. It's something that we impose from outside. But a little bit like your point about the psychological risks of thinking too long and too hard that you're in a simulation, he thinks if you spend too much time with these kind of questions that there's no self and there's no causality, you're going to fuck yourself up.
Yep.
And that psychologically, we tend to both impose and reify those. And as long as we remember that those are sort of functional impositions, that's okay. I wanted to read you this passage that I really uh, um, like from him that makes this point. He says, most fortunately, it happens that since reason isn't capable of dispelling these clouds, so the clouds that come from thinking no self, no causality, nature herself suffices to that person, to that purpose, and cures me of this philosophical melancholy and delirium. So for him, this preoccupation with no self and no causality, while probably true, you can be too preoccupied with it and cause yourself melancholy and delirium, either by relaxing this bent of mind or by some avocation and lively impression of my senses, which obliterates all these chimeras. I dine, I play a game of backgammon, I converse and am merry with my friends, and when, after 3 or 4 hours' amusement, I would return to these speculations, they appear so cold and strained and ridiculous that I cannot find it in my heart to enter into them any further. Do you like that?
I love good poetry from
Yeah.
400. Was this 400 years ago?
No, less, but this is 18th century. But I mean, he basically says, I think too much about no self. I think too much about this is Hume. So
Yeah.
I think too much about no self. I think too much about no causality. Um, I say fuck and I go play some checkers or backgammon or billiards or whatever he liked to play.
Right. Doctrinally, the story that comes to mind is the Buddha was asked whether an enlightened being reincarnates once they see through the illusion of self. Do they still keep reincarnating? And he said, "Look, you're like someone who's been shot in the chest by an arrow, and before you pull it out, you say." Who shot it? What's their name? What's their occupation? What wood was this made from? Where are these feathers from? You just need to pull the damn arrow out.
Yeah, yeah. All right, Dr. Hughes, I think we've pulled the arrow out. And this was very much a treat. So thank you for that.
My pleasure.
Um,
Thanks for asking.
and
Do you have a
yeah,
do you
yeah.
have a media recommendation this week?
I do, I do. Let's take our 5 second break. All right, so it is my turn to offer a recommendation. Some of our listeners were very happy. You'll be pleased to hear about Jay's recommendation of Andor last week. I got an email saying that it was a masterpiece. My recommendation is a story that I know that you and I both appreciate, and that is E.M. Forster's The Machine Stops, which we read together during the pandemic. And Forster, who's not known for science fiction at all, writes this bizarre long short story, shall we say, short novella about a world in which people primarily live in discrete cells underground with something functionally similar to YouTube for us,
Zoom and YouTube.
or Zoom and YouTube for us, and they essentially communicate with each other through screens. And the primary social activity is delivering short lectures to each other, a little bit like Jay and I are doing here. So no wonder we like it so much. As long as you can just stay in your basement,
I thought it
and
made
be
an attractive
unperturbed.
case for living during COVID times. Yeah.
Exactly. And perhaps was the one regret that COVID was over. So that's a very, now the fascinating thing about that story, of course, is that it is written more than 100 years ago. Or when was it written? I don't want to give the
1909, I think.
yeah, so more than 100 years ago.
Yeah.
And it is perceptive in a sort of mind-blowing way, capturing the kind of Zoom universe that, to a large extent, we still live in, but also this kind of there's a fetishizing in that world of ideas and of novelty for its own sake, a little bit like the sort of fetishizing that we have and the impatience that we have with excavating and following an idea through carefully rather than jumping to the next one. So very much recommended.
Fantastic. I loved it and have recommended it to many people as well, even though it goes against my techno progressive aspirations.
Yeah.
Because I would have loved if they'd found some compromise between the life that they had created for themselves and living on the surface. But eventually they give all technology up and go back to the surface.
Yeah, everybody lives underground, sustained by this large machine that seems to have a consciousness and a set of purposes of its own. And the title gives away what happens in the end, namely the machine stops. In addition to everything else, it has a very cool cyberpunk aesthetic, or steampunk.
I love the fact that he never
even
gives an explanation for why the machine stopped. It just stopped.
Yeah. All right. Pleasure as always, Dr. Hughes.
Yes. Thank you. Next time. Prosthetic Gods is hosted by me, Jay Hughes, and Nir Isakovitz, and is sponsored by the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies and the UMass Boston Center for Applied Ethics. You can find us at prostheticgods.podbean.com. In the words of Sigmund Freud, man has, as it were, become a kind of prosthetic god. When he puts on all his auxiliary organs, he is truly magnificent. But those organs have not yet grown onto him, and they still give him much trouble at times.